I want to spend some time this afternoon talking about American terrorists and a serious rethinking of how we're approaching this problem. I suspect that, like me, you were sobered by both the knife attack in Minnesota and the bombing attacks in New Jersey and in New York. We're very fortunate that while people were injured, no one was killed. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. There are new developments coming down the road. Part of what's happened is that the forces of Islamic supremacism have realized that they can randomly encourage people who aren't under their control, aren't part of their immediate network, aren't traceable in a normal way, to just go out and cause damage. Something we saw initially in Israel, where the better the Israelis got at closing off bombers and people who came with traditional weapons, the more they moved towards using knives, because it's pretty hard in any society to not have knives. And so the Israelis have gone through several waves of knife attacks that are quite serious. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a bookish Facebook Live, because I want to cite a couple of things I think are worth your looking at that help explain something. I am really puzzled by two patterns, and I've been trying to understand them. The first is the intellectual pattern, so that when something happens, for example, the first indicators are, please don't rush to judgment. You may note that the other day, Donald Trump was attacked for saying that something was a bomb. And in fact, CNN went so far as to literally take out of Hillary's video where she referred to it as a bomb. They edited it to get that out so that they could attack Trump for saying it was a bomb. Now, I was puzzled because it was a bomb. I mean, if something goes off that's an explosive device, it's a bomb. But you can't call it a bomb, because that would mean that Donald Trump was right. And since we know he was wrong, it can't have been a bomb. So even if it was a bomb, it wasn't a bomb. And then, by the way, in a bureaucratic absurdity, the Justice Department is now charging the bomber with a weapon of mass destruction, which is truly wrong and stupid. A weapon of mass destruction is a nuclear or chemical or biological weapon that kills thousands. And you totally degrade the language when you apply it to something like, for example, a pressure cooker bomb. But there are two aspects of this to really think about, that in terms of describing the weapons. You're now going to have people who use knives. So unless you think we need knife registration and waiting periods to buy knives and et cetera, which is of course an absurdity, that danger's there. You're going to have people who learn rapidly from events like New York that they can go online. I mean, think of the number of places you could go to buy a pressure cooker. They can build bombs that are not very good, not very sophisticated, but if all you're trying to do is cause turmoil, cause casualties, cause people to be frightened, you could have a number of these coming up. So we have a totally different threat that's a low threat level. No one event by itself is going to be decisive. But first of all, if you're the person who was knifed in Minnesota, it's 100% threat level. I mean, your life has been changed. You were attacked. You had to go to the hospital. The rest of your life, you'll remember what it's like to have somebody you thought was okay walk up and slash you with a knife. Second, if you're one of the, I think it was 28 or 29 people who were wounded in New York, if you were the policemen who were wounded in arresting this guy, you're going to have the same kind of reaction. I mean, for them, it's a 100% event. Now, it's not, so it doesn't do any good to have some theoretical academic bureaucrat explain to us, well, these are really very low-risk events, which apparently is the Obama-Clinton model. Secondly, though, once again, we've learned with the New York bomber that the FBI was warned. In fact, his father says flatly 2 years ago, he called the FBI and said, look, my son has gone kind of nutso, and you ought to look into it. Now, we've had a number of occasions like this, and next week I'm going to do several newsletters and papers, and I'm also going to do Facebook Lives on this whole absurdity in which the FBI has set a standard for tests that is so high that it makes no sense. Now, maybe part of it's because they don't have enough personnel and they don't have enough resources, in which case, frankly, we ought to dramatically increase the resource available to the FBI. Maybe it's because the culture that the Clinton-Obama model creates is a culture where you're not supposed to ethnically profile people. So, for example, We now know that this guy went back to Pakistan and Afghanistan for something like 11 months after his father said he was dangerous. Now, I would think if you are an immigrant who becomes an American citizen and we're warned that you may be becoming an Islamic supremacist, and you then go back to the center, one of the centers, of people getting trained into terrorism, that we should put you on a very high-level watch list. That didn't happen. And it didn't. We don't know why it didn't happen yet. I'm hoping that the House and Senate committees for Homeland Security will actually look at what's the protocol. I mean, why did they think this guy wasn't dangerous? This is the same thing I believe happened in San Bernardino, and we're putting together the research so that I can make sure that the fact checkers are happy. So I'm not going to make too many direct assertions today, except to note that there have been a number of cases where we were warned, we didn't pay attention. We were warned, frankly, about the major who shot people at Fort Hood. We knew that he had been doing things that were inappropriate, but the culture of the modern Clinton-Obama military, like the culture of the modern Clinton-Obama FBI, and the culture of the modern Clinton-Obama Homeland Security Department is, one shouldn't jump to conclusions. We shouldn't have ethnic profiling. Now, I will be candid. If I learned you spent a year in Norway, I don't have the same level of concern as if I learned you spent a year in the Northwest Territories of Pakistan. I don't know if that's profiling or not. I think it's common sense. And I think we ought to recognize that it's common sense. Now, there are two books I want to cite that I think help explain part of what we're living through, because the more you watch it, the gap between reality and our news media, bureaucracy, politician class, it gets bigger and bigger. The first is a book by Charles Murray called Coming Apart. Charles Murray is a brilliant scholar, wrote the most important book in welfare reform, a book called Losing Ground. He's at the American Enterprise Institute. And he wrote 2 years ago a book called Coming Apart, which was an analysis of what's happening to white America. And the essence of what Murray says is that for the very first time, we're getting an intellectual economic class that is different from the rest of us. He describes what he calls as super zip codes. And being an American, he shortens that to super zips. But a super zip code is a zip code in which you have the top 5% of income and the top 5% of education. And his point is that increasingly, people who go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, to use the three places he uses, marry people who go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. They then put their kids in prep schools to make sure that they can get into Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And the result is they are further and further alienated from normal American life. So that, for example, when Donald Trump began to run, most of the people in this super zip code world had never seen The Apprentice. They had no idea it had been the #1 TV show. They didn't watch Miss Universe. They had no idea that Donald Trump was the host of Miss Universe and owned Miss Universe. So he was outside their world. And in their world, you can't talk about Islamic supremacism because that would be Islamophobia. In their world, you can't talk about America as #1 because that would be a kind of nationalism that's xenophobic. Just read the words Hillary Clinton used the other week when she began to describe the deplorables. And the reason she got this applause was in their world, they have such arrogance, such a sense of moral superiority that they believe that the rest of us are stupid. Yeah. Now, this was brought further into light, and we're going to post this so you can see it. It'll be at gingrichproductions.com, I think, unless Christina tells me I'm not allowed to do it. An article written 6 days ago by Nassim Taleb, who wrote the book, and I may have gotten his name mispronounced, and I apologize to him if I did, who wrote the book, The Black Swan. He wrote this utterly brilliant article on what he calls IYI, intellectual yet idiot. And his point is, and I think it really explains a lot of what we've been living through. You now have a class of people who are very important. They're on all the TV talk shows. They're in much of the bureaucracy. They are the people who surround candidates for office. And these are people who are really good at taking tests and writing papers. And so they take tests and they write papers, so they get to go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or some other prestigious place where they then really do well at taking tests and writing papers. So then they graduate, so they get to become professors who take tests and write papers. So then they go from their professorship maybe to working at the CIA, or they go from their professorship to working for the Federal Reserve System. And Nassim Taleb's point is, these people don't do anything. They don't know anything. They've never been in the real world. What they have is this theoretical, abstract vision of reality. So you have all sorts of people at the University of Chicago who will give you solid liberal opinions about the South Side of Chicago who've never been to the South Side of Chicago. They don't go into the neighborhoods. They don't understand what's going on. Years ago, I read a book about When Children Have Children, written by a black reporter who'd been at the Washington Post. And he wanted to go into public housing and understand what happened. And when he went to Bob Woodward and said, I really want to write this, Woodward said, fine, we'll support you on it, but you have to go and live there for 18 months in public housing. People have to get used to you. They have to talk to you. Now, that's an investment very few sociology majors make. It's an investment very few economists or political scientists make. So he went and he lived there for 18 months. He's an African American in an African American public housing project. The opening of the book, he says, after about 6 to 8 months, he began to realize that every story he'd been told was a lie. That the people had a version of reality they made up for outsiders that made them victims. And that once you got to know them and they began talking to you as a normal person, the stories changed dramatically. Now, think what that does to all the sociology research that liberals rely on. Because it says they don't know anything. You know, they drop in for a weekend. They have people fill out a questionnaire. And then they write something as though it mattered. And then that moves to something else, which moves to something else. In a book that I've cited before, Dreamland, one of the most interesting examples is the shift in how we think about pain, which goes back to a 2 or 3 page article that had no research data, but that fit the ideology of the people who cared about the idea of having people take drugs and the idea of treating pain. So I think it's a very important concept for us to recognize that a lot of the people doing all this analysis aren't in touch with the real world. You get into the upper level bureaucracies of government, whether it's the city of New York, the state of New York, the federal government, you're dealing with people who aren't necessarily very much in touch with the real world. One of the reasons that Rudy Giuliani was able to dramatically turn around New York City and reduce murders by 85% was that he brought in Chief Bratton, who was a real policeman. He wasn't an administrator, he wasn't a politician, he was a cop. And he understood how cops work, and he understood how crime worked, and he understood how neighborhoods worked. And so he could bring about, in a very short time, a revolution in the level of crime in New York City. And we need to get back to real people. And one of my favorite people is a retired Marine general who happens to be a great combat commander, which of course made him very suspicious to the bureaucrats in the White House and the bureaucrats in the Pentagon and the bureaucrats at the State Department, because he said things that were just made sense, and he happened to get things done. But getting things done may not be as important as being politically correct. So what you have right now is we have to really take apart how we think about terrorists in America. We have to face facts. I believe we have to decide that acts of war against the United States by American citizens are acts of treason. I also believe we may have to start issuing conditional citizenship, that if you engage in attacks on the United States, you lose your citizenship if you're a first-generation migrant. I mean, why should we go through this baloney of treating somebody who is setting off bombs as though they're somebody who loves America? I'll close with this example, and we'll come back with a lot more material next week, and then we're going to answer some questions. The Pakistani American citizen who tried to set off a car bomb in Times Square several years ago was brought up in front of the judge. And the judge said to him, I don't understand this. You're an American citizen. You swore an oath to the United States. And the man looked at him with total contempt and said, Judge, you are my enemy. I lied. Now think about that. I mean, here's a guy who understands he came to the U.S., he became a citizen, decided to set off a car bomb, tried to kill as many people as he could. Luckily, he didn't know how to do it, and the car just fizzled and smoke came out. And one of the guys running a hot dog stand went over to the cops and said, oh, by the way, that car is smoking. And they found out it was a car bomb designed to kill lots of people in Times Square. And the guy said, I lied. Well, when you know somebody's lied, when you know they've committed an act of war against the United States, you should not have to treat them as though they were inside criminal law. These people are engaged in war, doing acts of war designed to kill a lot of people. And Congress is going to have to pass new laws. We're going to have to give the FBI new powers. We're going to have to resource those powers. And one of the places we should start is to pull together every single person who the FBI was warned might be a terrorist and find out exactly what happened, and then go to work on making sure that we take care of these folks in a different way with a different standard. We have no reason to allow people to come to America to lie to us about their intention than to sit by idly and passively while they become radicalized, figure out how to kill us, and go out to do that. We have every reason to put the burden on them, not on us. Now, Steve Haber says, it seems the children of recent immigrants are susceptible to becoming radicalized. Under our Constitution, how do we prevent the teaching and implementation of Sharia policies? It's a great question. I think you should not just say people who are second generation. I think we see some examples of native-born Americans being radicalized who have no relationship, because the internet's powerful, the messages are powerful. We should not underestimate the emotional and powerful appeal of the messages of Islamic supremacists. And people who live in a world where they have lost any connection with God, they have no sense, their lives feel empty, they seem to have no purpose. This is a pretty powerful calling. And we see all across the Western world people who are surprising, who end up, as Tony Blair said at the time of the London bombings in 1996, they were, or in 2006 rather, they were born in Great Britain, raised in Great Britain, went to British schools, had British jobs, lived in British housing, and every single person involved in the bombings in London was somebody who you would not have expected to end up as a radical. And that requires us to rethink based on reality. And the point of describing intellectual yet idiot is to say to you, if you get somebody making an argument that has nothing to do with reality, like you shouldn't call a bomb because it's not appropriate to call it a bomb, because after all, that would be like rushing to judgment that it's a bomb. Or the mayor of New York, de Blasio, who is clearly an intellectual yet idiot. I'm sure he has great education credentials, but his comment, you just look at his comments on the bombing. I mean, this is a guy who's out of touch with reality. He's in La La Land. And we ought to have the honesty. You don't debate people who are in La La Land. You just say, okay, that guy's nuts, next topic. John LaFollette, there is reasonable suspicion terrorists use mosques as cover. In a politically correct environment which tends to protect mosques from scrutiny, how can we take a closer look at them? We have an absolute obligation to learn from the Egyptians and others that if you have reason to believe a mosque is radical, we're going to have to find ways to have people there. We're going to have to find ways to look at the sermons. If you find you have an imam who is teaching jihad, you have to close them down. Freedom of speech cannot mean the right to destroy American civilization. As several American leaders have said over the years, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And I think we have to be serious about stamping out all of the efforts to radicalize our citizens and all of the efforts to convince people to wage war against us. Kathy Ann, how can the president be stopped from importing even more refugees? I think Congress ought to cut off the money. I mean, I'm tired of being told that the legislative branch is helpless, that we can't do anything about it. Now, obviously, the presidential election will decide a lot. Trump will clearly cut it off. Hillary will clearly expand it. So in that sense, one of the big issues in October is going to be, despite the knives, the bombings, et cetera, do you want more refugees coming in? If you do, vote for Clinton. Do you think it's time to slow down the refugees? Vote for Trump. But ultimately, the Congress also has the opportunity to cut off the money. Renee, I'm very similar. I'm very distraught over the Syrian refugees Obama is allowing to come into our country starting in October. Can President Trump stop this craziness, and can he send home the thousands already here? As I said, I mean, I would love to see the Congress have the courage to zero out funding for any new refugees. Let Obama veto the budget, the continuing resolution, over whether or not he could bring in more Syrian refugees after New York, after Minnesota, after Orlando. I think that's a pretty good place to raise the question. Why do we have an obligation to import people? And by the way, the State Department is now beginning to admit that ISIS is deliberately putting terrorists into the stream of refugees. And this goes back to Taleb's concept of intellectual yet idiot. I mean, if your enemy tells you, yes, I'm using the stream of refugees to send people in who want to kill you, if you actually have real incidents in which people try to kill you, at what point do you have to assume the guy designing this policy may have a PhD, or they may have a law degree, but they're idiots? And I think the Taleb really gives us a whole new way of understanding the challenges we face. So, last question today. Kim Williams. Obama recently assembled $1.5 billion in cash, sending it to Iran. Who is required to sign off on assembling that amount of cash? Is that a potential security risk to our national financial system? It's not a security risk to our national financial system because he sent it in cash, which is, the Iranians interpret as frankly, us paying them some kind of homage. From their standpoint, we are paying them tribute. It's crazy. I mean, if you're the Iranians, you think this is great. I mean, the Americans are so... Remember, we went from George W. Bush on the 20th of September, 2001, the week after 9/11, saying that there was an axis of evil, and Iran was one of the three countries he listed, to us sending the Iranians billions of dollars. This is insanity. This is precisely what intellectual yet idiot leads you to. I mean, how can you possibly say you're serious about fighting terrorism as you hand over cash? By the way, the Obama State Department, the Hillary Clinton State Department, lists Iran as the largest provider of state terrorism in the world today. So while we're listing them as the largest provider of state terrorism, we're giving them the cash to pay for the terrorism while we explain that we're against terrorism. There are no practical words beyond Taleb's to describe people so dumb that even with all their degrees, they're out of touch with reality. That's where we are, and that's why this election is so important. And I hope you find this useful, and we'll have more material over the next few days.